Hello mate and welcome to a slightly different video. In this video I'm just going to deal with a question that somebody asked. Actually the specific question was about creating a cell phone or a mobile phone in Ren'Py, and essentially the question is about creating user interface elements, because once we have all of the elements that we need, we just use a screen to put them together. And then we use an if statement to decide which bits of the user interface that we're going to display. So for example, if the player doesn't have a mobile phone, then we'll show a standard top bar element at the top of our screen. But if the player does have a mobile phone in their possession, then we can not display the top bar and instead display the other part of the user interface that we create, so that the interface can be different. And it doesn't have to be a mobile phone, it can be basic, literally anything. You could just have slightly different top bars based on how much cash the player has, for example, where you have like a, I don't know, you know, really sort of like shabby basic looking one if the player has no money, and then it gets made out of different materials and looks slightly different or whatever. I mean, these are all things that are entirely possible just using if then else statements, which at this stage I would imagine everybody who watches my channel has figured out how to do. So instead I'm going to focus in this episode on creating or just showing you how I go about creating a user interface. So we start off with a basic image in Ren'Py, simple background. This one's 3840 by 2160, but this can be 1080p if you want it to be. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a nice big brush, nice big soft brush, and I'm just going to make a very basic background so that we can essentially see what's going on when we create an interface over the top of it, because it's difficult to see when it's grey. So we're just going to literally just go and put a bunch of colours together. Maybe grab the smudge tool and just have at it a few times, and then give Photoshop about 20 minutes to catch up, because that's how much it loves the smudge tool. So that's our background layer made up, and this is literally just so that we can see something happening over the top of it. So we're just going to create a new layer, and we're going to concentrate on creating our user element. Now the first bit, that if you're creating a Ren'Py game, you are obviously going to want to include the dialog box in this to make sure that it looks the same. But it doesn't necessarily have to entirely match up, because you bear in mind that the rest of this user interface, the majority of the rest of the user interface, if you're creating a game similar to mine, for example, you're not going to be seeing all of those elements at the same time as the dialog box. So you do just have to kind of make up your mind whether or not you're going to design it so that it all is modular and all slots together quite nicely, or if there are elements of it that you don't care about them fitting in with everything else because they're not going to be shown at the same time. For example, if you had a map screen, you're probably not going to be showing the map screen at the same time as the rest of the interface unless you have it nested or as a kind of floating window. So for example, we create a top bar. We're just going to grab a rectangle marquee, and then we're going to fill it with whatever color we want. I'm going to go with black just for the sake of this demonstration. And then again, I'm going to grab my big brush tool, and I'm actually going to grab a slightly lighter color. It's only marginally lighter, and I'm just going to paint over half of my interface, and this just adds a tiny little bit of variety. The human eye will be able to pick up that subtle difference when they're playing the game for a long period of time, even if right now you don't. And if you want to make sure that it's kind of blended halfway, you can paint back over the other half in black. You can go extreme if you want to. You can make this as bright and colourful as you want. It's entirely up to you. And those of you that are familiar with my games will know that I tend to bring the opacity down to sort of probably more like 60% when it comes to user interface elements, something in that region, so that you can see that it's there. It's so that it's still sort of mostly opaque. And then I would strongly avoid, if you're going to do this, I would strongly avoid putting any effects on this individually. Things like drop shadows or embossing and things like that, it tends not to look very good because you're having overlapping transparent PNGs, and it just looks looks like garbage. If you're not going to use transparency at all, if you're going to have this as one solid color, then you can stick a drop shadow on it, absolutely. And it's not going to interfere with the other interface elements as long as they're all opaque as well and no transparency whatsoever. Because when they overlap, they'll cover up the shadows of each individual element, provided that you take that into account when you build these elements. However, for the sake of simplicity and to keep things looking clean, generally just avoid using effects and drop shadows and stuff. Now, I don't actually know the dimensions of this top bar at the moment, so what I have to do is I have to go into the properties tab and check to see what it actually is. So if I control click, no, that's not the right thing. If I control click on my element there, and then I bring up the properties window, which I don't appear to actually have open at the moment. Oh, I do have it open, it's just hidden. There it is. Okay, so now I know 101 pixels. Now I can change that if I want to, make it 100 pixels just to make it a nice round number, but the problem is because I've linked my width and height, that it's going to change those two things. So I need to now re-change this back to being the right size. Use the correct number, it's 3840. There we go. Now we know that it's 3840 by 100 at the top there. Okay. Now bear in mind, I am using a 4K image. If you are trying to copy what I'm doing and you're using a 1920 by 1080p image, you're going to need to half that number. So that is going to be 50 pixels high instead of 100 pixels high. Okay, so the next thing that I can do is I can create another box using essentially the same thing, and I'm going to drag this out and I'm just going to make it so that it looks about right. I'll do it on the right or the left. I'm actually going to do it on the right this time. Okay, so we can see that there, and what we have to do is we have to be a little bit careful because it's not completely black, but it's not going to make too much of a difference when we are using transparency, but even so, just bear that in mind. We're going to fill that with black, and then we're going to adjust the property. So as you can see, it currently is width 701, so we're going to change that to 700, and then we know that 3840 by 21, so 1080p is 2160, so we actually need to drop that by 6 pixels so that it actually fits, and then we need to change the Y coordinates to 100 pixels so that now it is perfectly matched up with our interface element there. As you can see, there's a slight gap on the right hand side though, so we can just use our right hand arrow to nudge that across, give us a nice solid thing. And now we're going to drop this down. If I remember rightly, I was at 51% opacity. As you can see, there's a subtle difference there, but not too bad, all things considered. And then basically, because they're on separate layers, we can export them individually. So if I wanted to just export that right box, I can turn off all my other layers, export this as a PNG, and then jobs are good. And we can just keep building interface elements. So for example, if I did want my dialog box to slot in with all the rest of this, I know that this is 700 pixels wide, so I know what size I'm going to have to create this box to be. So 3840 minus 700 is 3140. So I'm actually pretty close there. So we'll go ahead and create a new layer. We'll fill it with black again, and then I'll change this to 3140. I don't really need to worry too much about the size because the height, because it's going to be the height, whatever height I tell it to be, basically, as long as I'm happy with how it looks. And then we can go and deselect to make sure that it's not clipping off the bottom or anything like that. And then again, we can go and change the opacity to this to 51%. And there you go, we've got another user interface element. And we can save that, export that individually. Now you can either save it as is, like this, but obviously for the dialog box in Ren'Py, the image itself needs to be the size of the dialog box. So what we do in that case is we would control click there, and then we go to image crop, and there you go, it crops it down. And then when we've saved that, we can then just press Control Z, and it will come back and bring everything back again, as long as we don't close a document and reopen it. Yeah, so what I would strongly recommend is if you're building a UI like this, save every time you create a new element, save it as a PSD document so that you always have this in its format with the layers, and you can come back to it and grab any elements if you forget to save something or if you do something wrong or whatever. So that's basically what that is. And then realistically, if you absolutely wanted to, you could have some kind of inventory screen or information screen or map screen that comes in and fills the rest of this gap if you wanted to. But obviously bear in mind that the dialog box only shows in Ren'Py when there's actually dialogue to display, unless you have it permanently showing. But why you would want, you know, a third of your screen to be constantly taken up by a blank space is, you know, well, if that's what you want to do, then that's what you want to do, obviously. But for me, I'd like to hide in user interface elements that are not being used, or give the player the option to do so. So for example, having some kind of button on the right hand side of your user interface that allows you to close this or to dock it over to the right so that it kind of moves over to the right hand side, or however you want to do it. Again, this is all controlled with if statements. So you can say that you can have a variable which is a Boolean variable that's just true or false, like show right hand bar, and then in your screen you would just say if show right hand bar equals true, or shorthand if show right hand bar use right hand bar, else use right hand bar toggle button, and you just have a little button on the side that allows you to open or close it. So, you know, you've got these options available, and there's no rocket surgery involved here. This is all just using basic PNG files and using if statements in order to create the desired effect. Now, you know, if you have this whole mobile phone scenario where when the player has a mobile phone, the interface changes, like I did back in the first permutation of my game, you're going to want to be able to draw a mobile phone with, I would say, you don't want it to be too accurate, because you can get sued, believe it or not. If you're making a game and a manufacturer doesn't want you to use an image of their product, they are within their rights to prevent you from doing so, even if it's something you created itself. Because believe it or not, the way that an iPhone or a Galaxy S10 or whatever they're called, Samsung, I don't know Android, but you know, if the design of those phones is actually copyrighted, meaning that you cannot replicate it. So if you are going to create a mobile phone in your game, make sure it's, you know, only very loosely resembles the mobile phone that you're trying to mimic, if you are trying to mimic it. So for example, if I were to do this, for example, and then in the properties tab, we can actually change some of the properties of this. Anyway, we can change the I can't be bothered to find the damn thing at the moment, but we can change the properties of our rectangle to replicate the shape of a mobile phone quite easily. I can do it on a separate layer. That's tripping up. I've got my my Photoshop is set up for drawing these days, so I've sort of closed a load of windows that I would otherwise have had open. So you know, you can replicate the shape of a mobile phone quite easy. It's not there right now, so you know that it's just a black box. And then if you wanted to make the black box look a little bit more like, for example, it's got a glass front on it, all you'd have to do is go with a polygon marquee tool, polygon lasso tool, for example, and we can go like that. And then we would grab a simple white brush, perhaps not that big, but big enough, and then buzz across there. But we actually need to change the opacity of our layer right down to about 10%. Swoop across there a couple of times, get rid of our selection. Select all that, inverse our selection, and delete all of that extra crap. And we, you know, so it can give us that effect, effectively make it look like it's got a glass front on it. This is really rough and basic. I'm just kind of demonstrating how easy it is to create these things, just using a little bit of imagination and a little bit of practice with Photoshop. There's, you know, the sky really is the limit. You could have, because these are just JPEGs and PNGs, you can have absolutely anything in your user interface that you want. If you want animations, that's fine. You can do that as well. You're just going to have to create the frames for the animation. What I would strongly recommend is if you're going to use animations in your user interface, to use creator-defined displayables rather than things like film strip animations, just because they work a little bit quicker and they're less likely to slow down your game. One of the reasons that I don't use so much animation in my current permutation of my game is that using film strip animations does slow things down. So if you've got perhaps 10 characters in a scene all being animated, it starts to impact the player's ability to do things. You know, it slows down the reaction times of the game. So if you are going to do those things, then creator-defined displayables are the way to go for sure. But this is essentially it. This is the process, you know. It's just a case of draw the boxes, style them however the hell you want. You can make them look like they're made out of wood, like in Stardew Valley, or you can make them look super futuristic, like in some alien game or other. Entirely up to you. I just tend to prefer using clean shapes that don't have an awful lot going on, because I'm firmly of the belief that the user interface is meant to provide the user with feedback based on their actions, but not be so overwhelming that it distracts them from what is actually going on. But if you're one of those people who wants to make a nice, shiny, super futuristic, sexy looking UI, then you go straight on ahead and do that, yeah? Alright guys, well that pretty much covers what I wanted to talk about in this video, so thanks very much for watching. I hope you found it useful. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one. But until then, you take damn good care of yourselves, alright? Bye bye!